The room was already charged like a storm gathering over the horizon when Donald Trump leaned into the microphone and unleashed one of his trademark barbs. His voice, brash and unapologetic, carried across the auditorium, a mocking jab at Barack Obama, dismissive, smug, engineered to inflame. It wasn't just a critique, it was a pointed attempt to belittle, to reduce a legacy of service into a soundbite of insult. The audience gasped, some uneasy laughter rippled, cameras zoomed in, the spectacle had begun. But at the very moment when most people would have snapped back in anger, Barack Obama did something extraordinary. He stopped, stood tall, and simply looked at Trump. Not a twitch, not a flicker of irritation, just an unshaken calm that landed harder than any retort could in that instant. The silence spread like a force field, cool and immutable, drawing the crowd in closer. The contrast could not have been sharper. Arrogance puffed against dignity, still as granite. Viewers sitting at home felt the tension through the screen. Social feeds lit up instantly. What's Obama going to say? The collective anticipation made every second stretch out like an eternity. Even in the room, you could sense it, a tightening in the air, as though history itself was leaning forward. Because everyone knew, deep down, that this was more than two men trading lines. It was two visions of America colliding in real time, one built on bluster and provocation, the other on composure and quiet strength. Trump adjusted his tie, soaking, in the moment, convinced he'd landed the knockout. The smirk on his face told the story. He thought he had cornered his opponent, humiliated him before millions. But across from him, Obama's steady gaze said something else entirely. You've underestimated me. And worse, you've underestimated the people I represent. And then, a pause. The kind of pause that doesn't just hang, it tightens. The kind of pause that draws every ear, every eye closer. Everyone seemed to know instinctively. The fuse about to be lit would leave a crater. In that silence, as Trump tried to mask his unease with another twitch of bravado, the audience braced. Barack Obama was about to speak. And what would leave? His lips in the next breath wouldn't just level the playing field, it would deliver the silencing of the decade. This wasn't just another political spectacle. It wasn't another exchange of insults that would be forgotten in the morning headlines. What unfolded that night began with a single insult, but beneath it ran currents so deep they could pull the nation in whichever direction won out, toward division or toward dignity. Every eye was fixed on that stage, because everyone could sense something larger at play. The very soul of America was being contested in real time. Donald Trump's words were not merely blunt, they were laced with distortions, half-truths, and outright denials of reality. It was his signature style. Fire off so many exaggerated claims in rapid succession that no fact-checker could keep up, overwhelmed the audience until the fiction began to feel like reality. For years, he had thrived on that strategy. Inflate numbers, vilify groups, reduce complex issues into cartoon sound bites. To many, it was entertainment. But the darker reality was that each distortion chipped away at the fabric of truth itself. And on the other side of the stage stood Barack Obama, the man whose political identity had been forged in equal parts by patience and precision. He was not the loudest in the room. He didn't need to be. His strength came from clarity, his authority from reason, his resonance from an authenticity that carried weight far beyond applause lines. To millions of Americans, especially immigrants, minorities, and those who had felt targeted by Trump's rhetoric, Obama was more than a politician in that moment. He was their stand-in, their voice, their defender. The clash wasn't just a former president and a sitting one circling each other, it was two philosophies of leadership colliding. On one side, the quicksand of bluster. On the other, the bedrock of integrity. And for a nation polarized, families divided by politics, communities scarred by rhetoric, the confrontation felt personal. It was no longer red versus blue. It was respect versus ridicule, truth versus distortion, empathy versus ego. Every second that ticked by raised the stakes higher, because everyone knew that if Obama faltered, if he failed to cut through Trump's noise, the consequences would ripple far beyond that room. Fact would lose to fiction, dignity would be trampled under arrogance, and millions watching around. The world, especially those who had endured insults to their identity, would feel silenced by proxy. But if Obama succeeded, the counterblow would be more than a momentary takedown. It would be vindication, validation, a cinematic affirmation that truth still had power. Journalists in the audience leaned forward. Producers in newsrooms whispered to each other already, sensing they might be witnessing the clip that would play on repeat for years. And on social media, hashtags had already formed out of the first insult, with timelines buzzing in anticipation of a response. Internationally, too, the stakes were clear. Allies wondered if America's compass could still point toward dignity. Critics waited to mock its decline. Even Trump himself seemed to recognize the gravity, though his instinct was to double down. He smirked again, leaned in, fed another distortion into the microphone like tossing gasoline on a lit fuse. His camp cheered, but the mood was shifting. You could feel anticipation tilting toward Obama, as if everyone subconsciously expected the storm to break from his side. Because what happened in just a few minutes did not stay contained within those walls. It would dominate headlines, electrify timelines, and ricochet around the globe. The words about to be spoken weren't merely rebuttal, they would become the opening volley of a cultural earthquake. And the world would feel the tremors before dawn. To understand the weight of this clash, you need to understand the man who styled himself as untouchable. Donald Trump had built a persona not on precision, but on performance, on a kind of brash showmanship so relentless that it felt, at times, less like politics and more like a spectacle engineered for ratings. For years he had mastered the art of aggravation, thriving on friction, commanding cameras by saying the one thing no one else would dare, and then doubling down when called out. It was reckless, and it was deliberate. Trump didn't simply bend the truth. He mangled it, punched it into a shape that suited him in the moment. He could call unemployment the worst in history in one breath and declare his administration the best that ever existed in the next. He could rail against elites while ensconced in luxury high-rises, mock the struggles of working people while claiming to be their champion. For him, contradictions weren't flaws. They were features. The contradictions created the chaos, and in the chaos, Trump thrived. His style was never about persuasion through logic. It was dominance through disruption. Like a heavyweight swinging wildly in the ring, he overwhelmed by sheer force, throwing insult after insult until the opponent either tired or took the bait. Critics called it bullying. Supporters called it authentic. But underneath the bluster was a clear strategy. If the rules of debate call for precision, change the rules. If opponents bring facts, bring fireworks. If challenged, turn the spotlight on yourself by sheer volume. To his base, this disregard for norms was intoxicating. It looked like strength. It looked like fearlessness. Crowds adored the swagger, the nicknames, the performative aggression. They laughed when he mocked opponents. They cheered when he brushed off accountability. They leaned in closer when he sneered at entire communities. He gave voice to impulses that polite society had suppressed, and that was precisely why he stood, to many, as both irresistible and dangerous. But outside his base, the cracks showed. Analysts and opponents saw the recklessness not as boldness, but as brittle ego. His need to win every exchange at all costs turned him desperate. His parade of exaggerations left him vulnerable to being pierced by the one thing bluster could not withstand: calm truth. Because underneath the volume was a fragility, the awareness that he wasn't as prepared, as principled, or as disciplined as the leaders he mocked. It showed in debates past. How often had he refused to answer direct questions, steering instead into tangents of self-praise? How often had his insults glossed over the fact he had no real counter-argument? Yet over and over, the strategy worked, because his opponents flinched. They rolled their eyes, grew impatient, snapped back in frustration, exactly the reaction Trump craved. His genius was in baiting the opponent into his arena, where chaos was advantage. Trump was a master of dragging discourse into the mud and congratulating himself for winning there. And for years, no one had truly broken that spell. Opponents barked back, fact-checkers struggled to keep his distortions in check. Crowds left entertained, but clarity so often drowned in noise. He was the agent of bluster in an age addicted to drama. And bluster, unchecked, becomes intoxicating power, which is why this particular stage mattered. On this night, when the cameras rolled and millions tuned in, Trump did what he had always done. He leaned into arrogance. He lobbed insults. He fired off exaggerated claims. He smirked into the lights, confident that his volume alone would dominate the airwaves. It was a familiar performance, almost scripted by years of repetition. But the opponent across from him was not like the others. It wasn't a rival politician caught off guard or a media anchor pressed for time. This was Barack Obama, whose entire career had been built, not in the frenzy of volume, but in the theater of calm. A man who had spent decades refining the art of slowing conversations down instead of speeding them up. A leader whose discipline made him immune to the bait of chaos. And that was Trump's blind spot. He believed arrogance was armor, that exaggeration was invincible, that contradictions would collapse under the weight of their sheer number. But arrogance only works if the opponent matches it, if the opponent snaps, if they play on your terms. Obama knew better. Obama had walked through fire, racial slurs, conspiracy theories, doubts of his very legitimacy, and come out tempered. Trump had punched down time and again with no consequence, but this time, he wasn't punching down. He wasn't sparring with someone who would lose their composure or scatter under pressure. The man across from him was built for these moments, and more than that, he carried the weight of millions who depended on his answer. Trump had lived entire decades believing no silence could humble him, no words could puncture the bravado. But that belief was about to shatter. Because for all his sneers and insults, all his contradictions and bombast, Trump had never faced someone who could turn chaos into clarity with a single pause. Trump had never faced someone like Barack Obama. Not on that stage. Before there was the iconic calm face on that stage, there was a boy whose very existence posed questions America had never fully resolved. Barack Hussein Obama II came into the world in Hawaii, the son of a Kenyan father and a white mother from Kansas. His name alone seemed foreign, an easy target for mockery, and from the beginning he had to navigate what it meant to belong, while standing apart. In classrooms, on playgrounds, in his own neighborhoods, he carried the weight of difference, of skin, of heritage, of identity. Where some saw confusion, he learned resilience. Where some saw disadvantage, he cultivated empathy, a gift that would later define his speaking voice to millions who had felt invisible. Behind the eloquence people admired today was a young man, wrestling with contradictions of his own. Who am I? Where do I fit? He didn't emerge polished. He sharpened himself against the grindstone of life. Raised in modest circumstances, shifting between Hawaii and Indonesia, watching his mother sacrifice opportunity for his education, Obama grew into a man who understood instability as more than an abstract idea. He lived it. He lived the uncertainty of financial limitations, of cultural in-betweenness, of wondering if a country with such deep lines of division would ever allow someone who looked like him to lead. Education became his weapon and his window into possibility. At Occidental College, Columbia, and later Harvard Law, he carried both the pride of his background and the sting of scrutiny. He didn't fit neatly into expectations. He had to earn every ounce of legitimacy in rooms where people whispered, his name too differently, where they second-guessed his very presence. But instead of shrinking from those tests, he sharpened. His peers at Harvard saw not just intelligence, but patience, a mind that listened before it cut through noise. They recognized in him a leader who commanded with composure, not intimidation. Harvard, when it would have been easy to seek lucrative positions, Obama chose service. In Chicago, working as a community organizer, he walked the streets of disinvested neighborhoods. He listened to families navigating job losses, to parents frightened about schools, to seniors worried about their dignity slipping away with age. He sat at kitchen tables where hopelessness was an unwelcome guest. Those years weren't glamorous, but they taught him the language of everyday resilience, the kind of language no debating stage could fake. It was those experiences that shaped the cadence people would one day call presidential. When Obama spoke, he didn't just string words together. He carried whole communities in his timbre. The struggling worker, the overlooked immigrant, the young dreamer, they weren't abstract. Voters in his vocabulary. They were living presences etched into his voice. Each time he stood at a microphone, it wasn't just training, it was testimony. Of course, the climb wasn't smooth. His path into politics meant wading through rivers of doubt and opposition. His legitimacy was relentlessly challenged, his birthplace questioned, his patriotism maligned, his very identity treated as alien by the same country he sought to serve. Few leaders in modern times had endured so much skepticism about their right to simply belong, let alone lead. Yet through it all, he rarely raised his voice. He did something more powerful. He remained calm. That calm wasn't weakness. It was forged in fire. Every taunt about his name, every sneer about his otherness, every whisper of too different, all of it tempered him, layering steel beneath dignity. Where another might have lashed out, he chose precision. Where another might have broken, he chose grace. That restraint became his armor and his greatest weapon. By the time Obama ascended to the presidency, he carried not just his own ambitions, but the hopes of a fractured generation. He embodied the improbable becoming possible. Millions around. The world saw in him a reflection of themselves, a child of an immigrant, of mixed heritage, of humble beginnings who dared to step onto the grandest stage. His rise was a reminder. America could still surprise itself. But even as president, the storms never ceased. He governed through partisan sabotage, relentless misinformation, racial backlash. His opponents spewed venom with a frequency meant to overwhelm him into mistakes. Yet, time after time, he responded with the same slow cadence, the same careful prose, the same composure that signaled, "You cannot define me with chaos." And so, when Barack Obama stood across from Donald Trump on that stage, the blustering mogul who had ridden the wave of birther lies into political viability, it was more than political theater. It was a full-circle collision. The man who had endured years of Trump's conspiracies and taunts was once again face-to-face with the source. But this time, Obama carried more than patience. He carried vindication. This wasn't just any debate. Moment. For those who had ever been dismissed because of their accent, sneered at for their skin, belittled for their lineage, Obama's silence and eventual response symbolized more than words. It symbolized validation, that your dignity could outlast mockery, that your truth could hold, even when surrounded by distortion, that calm composure, sharpened in hardship, could still rise against arrogance. In that auditorium, Obama didn't carry merely his voice. He carried the immigrant mother who sacrificed dreams for her son. He carried the communities of Chicago still building hope against all odds. He carried the young dreamers who wondered if America had space for them, and when the moment came, he didn't just speak for himself. He spoke for millions. The air seemed thicker by the minute, as if every breath in the auditorium had become a spectator, every heartbeat waiting for the collision to intensify. Trump pressed forward exactly as expected, blunt, aggressive, interrupting. with a grin that seemed more rehearsed than authentic. He leaned toward his microphone, his voice pounding out insults like a hammer. He called Obama everything from weak to a failure, layering exaggerations with such speed they blurred together. At moments, the crowd groaned. At other times, his loyal onlookers chuckled. The performance was brash, heavy-handed, meant to rattle. But Obama didn't rattle. He sat upright, posture measured, hands resting as if carved into still granite. Each interruption rolled past him. Each insult reflected back like light bouncing off glass. He answered only when the moderators let him, his cadence noticeably deliberate, a contrast to Trump's rapid-fire dissonance. Where Trump threw sparks of chaos, Obama remained a steady flame, and that, oddly enough, began to shift the atmosphere. The calm seemed insurgent in the face of noise. Trying to seize attention, Trump cut into answers mid-sentence, chuckling, rolling his eyes, gesturing to the audience as if to say, "See how ridiculous this is?" It was classic Trump. Performative dominance. The illusion of being in control by sheer volume and bravado. Yet the more he pushed, the larger Obama's silence loomed. The composure started working against Trump like a mirror showing too much. Desperation. In close-up shots, the cameras betrayed the tension on Trump's face. The smirk was there, but tighter now, almost forced. Obama would answer calmly, referencing principles, dignity, values, and Trump would pounce immediately, hurling. Another accusation, another distortion. But if you listened closely, the rhythm was breaking. The interruptions came faster, the tone harsher. It was less strategy now, more urgency. The audience could feel it. They leaned forward, torn between the raw entertainment of spectacle and the gravity of what was unfolding. Journalists furiously typed notes, but even they knew. This was no ordinary back and forth. This was the embodiment of two Americas colliding in front of millions watching live. Obama's restraint did something most hadn't anticipated. It exposed Trump. The hero-villain framing was being dramatized not by narrative shaping, but by their own behavior unfolding in real time. On one side, mockery piling on like clumsy bricks. On the other, patience forming a foundation under pressure. And yet, the tension grew unbearable because Obama's silence had not yet broken. Attacks from Trump piled higher while the anticipation for Obama's definitive answer swelled like a drumbeat beneath the floor. Spectators weren't just listening, they were bracing, knowing instinctively the counterblow was only a matter of time. Trump spoke faster now, hands tightening into gestures sharp enough to cut the air. The insults stretched further, reaching for substance but offering spectacle. His jabs became vaguer, his boasts louder. It didn't matter whether his words held. They were tossed like smoke bombs designed to cloud the room. And for a moment, it looked like he had eclipsed the stage. His voice was everywhere, thundering through the microphones, filling every gap possible. But then, something happened. Not loud, but powerful. Obama raised his head, tilted slightly, lifted his hand, ever so slightly in acknowledgement of the moderator, and with that simple movement, the room hushed. The silence on his side of the stage commanded more gravity than Trump's entire uproar. It wasn't merely waiting to speak, it was letting the storm burn itself out until the calm could break through. Spectators exchanged glances, sensing the tide turning. They could almost hear it. The collective intake of air, the invisible pressure building. Trump's grin flickered as he realized that despite the noise he had created, the attention was no longer fully his. It was shifting, slipping away, heading toward the man who had barely spoken above a conversational tone. Obama's eyes locked on his opponent for a fraction longer than usual. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even disdain. It was something far more dangerous to arrogance. Quiet certainty. In that moment, the calm didn't just resist chaos, it began to control it. And then, just like that, in a matter of seconds, everything shifted. It began with stillness. The room, crackling just moments before with interruptions and laughter, now seemed to hold its breath. The storm of Trump's noise still lingered in the air, words hurled like debris in a whirlwind. But at its center stood Obama, calm as ever, waiting. He didn't rush his reply. He didn't meet insult with insult, didn't match volume with volume. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his voice low, steady, etched with the kind of confidence that made people's spines straighten unconsciously. "Let me be clear," he started, measured, deliberate. He didn't even look directly at Trump as he spoke, but at America itself. The audience leaned forward as if pulled by gravity, every syllable tightening the silence. His tone wasn't the defensive rustle of a man cornered. It was the steady voice of a man who had already measured his opponent and chosen the moment to strike. Trump tried to cut in, a half-laugh audible into the microphone. But this time, it fell flat. The audience wasn't with him anymore. They were, with the man calmly dismantling him, layer by layer. Obama continued, methodical, surgical. He pointed to Trump's distortions, not with anger, but with clarity. Every claim, every boast was refuted not with defensive scrambling, but with calm truth, rooted in values. In a voice almost softer than usual, he reminded the crowd that leadership wasn't about who spoke the loudest or interrupted the most, but who listened, who bore responsibility, who represented every American, not just the ones in the front row. The words stung deeper because they weren't insults. They were indictments. Delivering each phrase like a scalpel, Obama cut away at the facade Trump wore, exposing the insecurity underneath the bravado. For the first time that night, the swagger seemed to fade from Trump's face. The smirk faltered. His interruptions. He sputtered, then grew quieter. And each silence, each missed attempt to derail, only amplified Obama's dominance. Then came the pivot. The transition every great speech has, where the personal becomes universal. Obama turned from Trump to the crowd, and by extension the country watching beyond it. He stopped speaking to his opponent and started speaking for the millions who had endured the kind of treatment Trump specialized in: ridicule, dismissal, belittlement. He spoke for immigrants who had been told they didn't belong. He spoke for families mocked for their accents, for their skin color, for their hardships. He spoke for communities bruised by cynicism, by casual cruelty passed off as strength. Each line resonated like a heartbeat. Obama wasn't defending himself anymore. He was standing as a shield for countless others. And with every word, Trump shrank. On live television, the contrast sharpened by the second. One man grew smaller in his seat while the other grew larger than the podium itself. One filled the air with repetition. The other filled it with resonance. The room could sense the shift in power. What had begun as a clash of egos became something else entirely, a study in dignity towering over arrogance. The crowd began to react, first with murmurs, then with gasps, and finally with thunderous applause. The kind of applause that isn't just politeness, but catharsis. People weren't just clapping for the cleverness of a comeback. They were clapping because someone had finally said aloud what millions had carried silently in their hearts. Trump fidgeted, visibly uncomfortable. He tried to roll his eyes, to chuckle as if unconcerned, but his posture betrayed a man rattled. The showman who thrived on breaking others down was now cornered by composure, a force he couldn't outshout. He opened his mouth once more, but the audience drowned him out with applause that felt like a wave crashing back against the tide of his bluster. And then came the knockout. Obama, pausing for effect, looked directly at Trump for the first time. The silence that fell was immediate and total. His gaze was steady, not angry, not mocking, simply resolute. "The presidency isn't a reality show," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "It's about the lives of real people. People you mock when you think no one is listening. People you dismiss because they don't look like you or live like you. But here's the truth. Their story is America's story, and you can't silence that, no matter how loudly you shout." The words landed like a hammer against brittle glass. The reaction was seismic. The audience erupted, a roar that seemed to shake the very air, wave after wave of applause, cheers, even shouts of affirmation. Cameras caught the energy, the faces lighting up, the tears in the eyes of viewers who had waited years for this exact moment of validation. In that roar, Trump's mask cracked further. He leaned back, pursed his lips, tried to hide irritation behind a sneer. But the damage was done. The power dynamic had flipped, irreversibly. The villain who built his domination on disruption was now being drowned out not by volume, but by dignity itself, a force louder than any insult could ever be. What made the moment devastating wasn't just the phrasing, elegant as it was. It was the honesty behind it, delivered without shouting, yet louder in impact than Trump at his noisiest. Obama wasn't merely defending an argument. He was defending a people, their identity, their worth. And in that instant, he wasn't just a man at a podium. He was a vessel for millions of voices long stifled, finally given resonance. The camera zoomed in on Trump's face. For once, there was no comeback. No nickname, no sneer, no quick jab. Just silence. Silence that confirmed the blow had landed squarely. The applause lasted longer than expected, washing over the stage until even Obama had to look down with a faint smile, perhaps humbled by the response, perhaps aware that this moment was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had been waiting for it. When the crowd finally eased, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was monumental. It was the silence of a man who had just been rendered speechless, and another who had just spoken a truth that reverberated far beyond the walls of the room. And though the debate still had time left, everyone knew. The moment had already been decided. It wasn't just a counterpunch. It was a defining blow, one destined to live beyond the stage, beyond the night, beyond the cycle of news. The echo of that moment would not stay in the room. It would ignite a firestorm. It didn't even take minutes. It was seconds. The moment Obama delivered the line that sliced through Trump's bravado, the event leapt from the debate stage into the bloodstream of the internet. Phones lit up across living rooms. Hashtags mushroomed in real time, and the silence that had rattled Trump morphed into a thunderstorm of digital noise. By the time the applause in the room had subsided, Yikauench Obama shut it down and asked Shun, silencing of the decade. We're already climbing the ranks on Twitter. Clipped footage spread like wildfire. 15-second videos looped over and over, capturing the exact moment Trump's smirk vanished and Obama's words cut through, immortalized with captions like, "This is what leadership looks like," and "calm chaos." Memes followed instantly. Side-by-side photos of Trump's tight-lipped grimace next to Obama's steady gaze, GIFs looping the key line, parody soundtracks remixed with cinematic crescendos. For a generation fluent in digital humor, the exchange became more than politics. It became entertainment, catharsis, an instant cultural artifact. Major commentators wasted no time. Political analysts described it as one of the sharpest debate moments of the decade. Late-night hosts pre-recorded their monologues with fresh material served on a silver platter. Journalists worked overtime, slotting headlines like "Obama silences Trump in stunning clash" atop their web pages, while talk shows invited pundits to relive the scene frame by frame. It was no longer just a debate moment. It was a defining cultural moment on the order of a viral knockout punch, something that transcended politics and became shared folklore. But the most powerful reaction didn't come from blue-check commentators or studio panels. It came from everyday people. Immigrant families recorded themselves applauding in their kitchens. Teachers replayed Obama's line for their students, praising it as a lesson in dignity. Parents wrote about watching with their children and finally having a moment to point to their screen and say, "That's what it looks like when arrogance is challenged with calm." For countless people who had endured the brunt of Trump's rhetoric, Whether as immigrants, minorities, or simply citizens exhausted by chaos, Obama's words felt like vindication. Their pride surged, not because a politician had scored a point in a televised argument, but because, for once, their dignity had been spoken into the record. Entire communities recognized themselves in his composure. The immigrant worker mocked for an accent, the single mother belittled for her sacrifice, the neighbor dismissed because of their name. Obama seemed to carry their struggle into that moment and answer Trump's cruelty on their behalf. On TikTok, second-generation kids stitched the clip with personal testimonies. For everyone who said my family doesn't belong, this one was for us. On Instagram, Reels paired Obama's words with triumphant music, turning the takedown into motivation. Even on Facebook, where divides often boiled bitter, the clip drew streams of comments with thousands writing, "Finally, someone said it." The ripple effect extended beyond households. Political leaders abroad commented, allies praising Obama's reminder of dignity, adversaries mocking Trump's visible unraveling. In Europe, South America, and Africa, newspapers ran headlines the next morning framing the exchange not as simple debate drama, but as a referendum on America's very soul. And within the U.S., politicians across the spectrum had to react. Progressive leaders amplified the clip, using it as fuel for campaigns about truth, empathy, and inclusivity. Even moderates praised Obama's precision, contrasting it with Trump's chaos. But perhaps the most striking ripple was cultural. It became not just a moment of politics but a piece of art, recycled, reframed, remixed into everything from spoken word performances to editorial cartoons. It felt less like commentary and more like folklore retold in countless forms. The villain undone, the hero's truth resounding. And yet beneath the memes and applause lived something heavier. For the millions who felt marginalized, demeaned, or excluded in recent years, this moment wasn't just politics, it was personal. On stages and screens often dominated by ridicule, they had seen someone restore their dignity in prime time. It was validation that composure could still overcome chaos, that calm could still silence cruelty. But here's the truth about moments like this. Their resonance doesn't end when the hashtags stop trending. When the memes fade and the laughter quiets, the deeper meaning lingers. And critics, supporters, and skeptics alike began to recognize that this exchange wasn't simply another round of partisan fireworks. Yes, the cheers were loud. Yes, the clips went viral. Yes, the applause rolled like thunder. But beyond the noise on social media, beyond the headlines and hashtags, something far deeper was stirring. Because beyond the cheers, something deeper was happening. When the storm of applause quieted and the headlines began to crystallize, the moment revealed itself for what it truly was. Not just a triumph of wit over bluster, but a lesson carried straight into the conscience of America. Barack Obama's calm counterattack had landed because it wasn't anchored in ego. It was anchored in service, in values, in a vision of leadership that measured strength not by how loud you were, but by how deeply you respected the people you claimed to serve. That was the universal truth pulsing at the heart of his words. Service above self, dignity above arrogance, compassion above cruelty. For all of Trump's noise, the contrast illuminated something timeless. Leaders may come and go, movements may rise and fall, but the measure of leadership has always been grounded in how one treats those with the least power, not how one flexes over those with the most attention. Obama had framed it perfectly, without theatrics, without venom. And the resonance was immediate because people recognized in it the values so often buried beneath the static of modern politics. The moment extended beyond party lines. It was bigger than red versus blue. What viewers felt was elemental. The hunger to be respected, the desire to live in a world where dignity mattered, where truth wasn't drowned by distortion. For a country weary of outrage and exhausted by division, Obama's composure offered something like oxygen. Suddenly, millions saw what it could look like again. Politics not as spectacle, but as service. For immigrants and the children of immigrants, the speech struck even deeper. It wasn't theoretical, it was personal. In Obama's words, they heard echoes of their own stories. Parents working long hours, relatives navigating language barriers, families sacrificing dreams for opportunity that might take generations to fully bloom. They recognized their accents, their histories, their traditions in the face of someone who had spent years belittling them. And they saw, at last, those stories defended with eloquence and authority. This was not simply Obama defending himself. This was him defending the nurse whose accent drew ridicule from patients, the farm worker whose labor was invisible but essential, the student mocked for their name, the hijab-wearing mother stared at in grocery stores, the young man judged, first by his skin and not his soul. To them, the rebuttal was not abstract, it was vindication. That validation is why the moment spread so quickly. People didn't just share the clip because it was entertaining or savage. They shared it because it reminded them of who they were, of the worth they carried, of the fact that in an America that sometimes seemed to drown them out, a former president had just spoken directly on their behalf, and therein lay the crescendo. Obama turned Trump's insult into an altar of resilience. Rather than descend into the mud, he rose, and in doing so, carried others with him. He proved that it is possible to look arrogance in the eye without adopting arrogance yourself, to face cruelty without surrendering kindness, to endure insult, and still maintain grace. It wasn't just politics, it was identity affirmation for millions watching. For the immigrant mother, her pride was reflected in his restraint. For the mixed-race child, his journey confirmed that being different wasn't a weakness, but a strength. For the families split by political rhetoric, his calm offered proof that it was still possible to win without hatred, to lead without humiliation. The irony, of course, was that the silence, the calm before the counterstrike, carried more force than any insult ever could. Dignity, it turned out, had a volume louder than rage. And in embodying that truth, Obama gave millions permission to feel pride again. Not tentative pride, not cautious belonging, but an unshakable certainty that they had a place in this country. This was the lesson that lingered after the clapping stopped. Leadership is not about how much you take for yourself, but how much you give of yourself. Ego may entertain, but service endures. Hate may dominate headlines, but dignity etches itself into history. And when Obama spoke that night, he didn't just correct a distortion or silence an insult. He reframed the moment as part of a deeper story, the long, ongoing story of America itself, one that is more resilient than any one demagogue, more generous than any one insult, more inclusive than any wall or border could ever dictate. Because in the end, it was never just one man standing against another. It was the story of immigrants and workers and dreamers, of ordinary people who refused to be erased. And what made millions lean forward, share the clip, and feel seen was this knowledge. When Obama rose to speak, he spoke for them. And with each retelling, each share, each person swelling with validation, that truth only grew louder. Service above ego, dignity above hate, identity as strength, not liability. That was the legacy of the moment. What began as a clash of insults ended as a lesson etched in memory, and its resonance would outlast not just the debate, but the news cycle itself. Because what the world had just witnessed wasn't only a takedown, it was resilience in action. It was pride reborn. It was dignity defended. And so we return to the moment that started it all, the headline clash that sent shockwaves through America and across the globe. Barack Obama silences Donald Trump in savage clash that stuns America. It wasn't hyperbole, it was history unfolding right before our eyes. What we witnessed was not merely a debate exchange, it was a collision of values, crystallized in one unforgettable night. On that stage, arrogance was loud, but dignity was louder. Noise tried to dominate, but truth endured. Trump brought insults. Obama answered with calm. And in the end, America was reminded of something it had almost forgotten, that real strength doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from lifting others up. This was more than a viral moment. It was a reaffirmation of what we long to see in our leaders and what we long to see in ourselves. Composure under pressure, courage laced with compassion, the ability to silence hate not with more hate, but with a truth that resonates deeper and longer than anger ever could. And that's where you come in, because this story is not just Barack Obama's. It's not even just America's. It's yours. Every time you share it, remember, you're amplifying more than a clip. You're amplifying dignity. You're reminding others that arrogance crumbles, but resilience stands. So take ownership of this moment. Pass it on. Let it inspire conversations in your family, your community, your circle of friends. Share it as a declaration that you stand on the side of service, of justice, of belonging. Because when we raise our voices together, arrogance is silenced and dignity carries the day. This is not just the silencing of a man, it's the vindication of a people. And that story is only just beginning.